Imagine a battlefield, the deafening sounds of war echoing in the distance, and the heavy burden of uncertainty weighing on a young soldier's shoulders. His hands are trembling as he sits down to write one last letter, a letter that would never be delivered. This wasn't just any letter, it was the final communication from a black soldier, sent from the front lines of a war that seemed endless and brutal. In this letter, he didn't just share his hopes, his struggles, or his fears. No, this letter held something far more powerful, a truth that would shake the foundations of everything he believed about the world, his country, and the very people he was fighting for. What he wrote would go on to reveal shocking truths about the nature of war, the treatment of black soldiers, and the brutal realities that are often hidden in the shadows of history. In today's video, we will dive deep into the powerful words of this soldier's final letter to his mother. This letter is more than just a piece of correspondence, it is a glimpse into a world of pain, sacrifice, and untold truths that history has often overlooked. You'll see how this letter uncovers the shocking mistreatment of black soldiers during wartime and reveals the heartbreaking reality of their struggles, both on the battlefield and at home. For decades, stories like these have been ignored, buried beneath layers of time and the false narratives of war. But this letter, this one simple yet profound letter, has the power to expose the raw, unfiltered truth that many have worked so hard to suppress. As we read through the words, we begin to understand the struggles of this soldier, his complex emotions, and the anguish he carried as he fought for a country that never truly recognized his worth. The letter reflects his deep sense of betrayal, of being torn between his duty and the painful reality of how he and his comrades were treated. It paints a vivid picture of his inner conflict, how he faced the harsh conditions of the battlefield while simultaneously dealing with the racial prejudice that ran rampant both in the military and back home. But the most striking part of the letter is the chilling realization that this soldier knew his chances of returning home alive were slim. He was writing not to share a tale of triumph, but a message of closure, of finality, and of a truth that was almost too painful to put into words. As we piece together the story behind this soldier's final words, we also begin to unravel a broader, more complex narrative about the role of black soldiers throughout history. How they were often overlooked, their contributions diminished, and their sacrifices forgotten. This letter, written with the raw honesty of someone who knew their time was running out, lays bare the harsh reality of their experiences. Yet, it also raises a question that has lingered for generations: why was this story not told sooner? Why did it take so long for the truth to surface, for the bravery and pain of these soldiers to be acknowledged? But the most shocking revelation comes not from the soldier's personal hardships or the injustice he faced, but from what he says about the country he was fighting for. His words expose the harsh truth about the disconnect between the promises made by those in power and the realities faced by those who served. As the letter unfolds, we start to see the deep divide that existed between the ideals of freedom and equality, and the brutal realities of segregation and racism. It's a truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about the history of this war, and the sacrifices made by those who fought it. Now, imagine holding this letter in your hands, reading each word, each sentence, each emotion etched on the paper. How would it feel to uncover such an intimate, powerful, and raw message from someone who was on the brink of losing it all? This is the story we are about to uncover, a story that goes beyond the surface, beyond the traditional narratives we've been taught. The shocking truth behind this letter is one that not only changes our understanding of history but forces us to confront the uncomfortable realities that are often swept under the rug. But the question remains: what happens next? What other truths are hidden within the pages of this soldier's final letter? What does his story reveal about the larger fight for justice, equality, and recognition that black soldiers had to endure? These questions will leave you thinking long after this video ends, and in the next part of this story, we will uncover the full extent of what this letter exposes and how it changes everything we thought we knew about this chapter in history. So stay tuned, because the truth that's about to unfold will challenge your understanding of war, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. What you're about to learn is only the beginning of a deeper, more complex story that will leave you questioning the way history has been told, and the voices that have been silenced for far too long. The battlefield had always been a place of unimaginable horrors. But for the black soldiers, the horrors they faced were not only those of war. They fought a war on two fronts, one against an enemy overseas, and another against the deeply rooted racism that existed within the very institutions that sent them into combat. These soldiers, who had enlisted with the hope of proving their loyalty, courage, and patriotism, quickly found that their struggles were far from over. The stark reality of their position came crashing down as they discovered the stark divide between the promises of equality and the harsh treatment they received in the ranks. The young man who wrote the letter had grown up in a small town, a place where life was simple but hard. His family was poor, but they had each other. His mother, a woman of great strength and resilience, had always taught him that the world was full of opportunities for those brave enough to chase them. His father, who had passed away when he was young, had fought in the Great War, and the stories he left behind shaped much of the young man's desire to serve. His father spoke of camaraderie, honor, and the pride that came with wearing a uniform. But his father had also spoken of the pain of not being fully recognized for his sacrifices, the sting of racial injustice that haunted him even on foreign soil. These were the lessons that had been passed down to the boy, the lessons that would soon clash with the harsh realities of war. When the young man enlisted, he carried with him the hopes of his mother and the legacy of his father. But what he didn't expect was the isolation he would face as a black soldier. From the moment he set foot on the training grounds, it was clear that his path would not be the same as that of his white counterparts. The constant segregation, the insults, the cruel treatment from his fellow soldiers, and the indifference of the officers, all of it wore him down slowly, piece by piece. Yet, he continued to push forward, determined not to let the prejudice around him define his experience. He tried to block out the whispers, the stares, and the feeling that he was always being watched, judged, and scrutinized. But deep inside, he knew something was terribly wrong. His first few months on the front lines were a whirlwind of chaos and confusion. The battles were unrelenting, each day blending into the next in a haze of gunfire, mud, and loss. The noise of war was deafening, the constant threat of death looming over every soldier, regardless of color. But even amidst the horrors of the battlefield, there were moments of fleeting camaraderie. His fellow soldiers, despite the racial tensions that festered back home, shared a bond forged in the flames of combat. There was no time to focus on differences when survival was the only goal. But that bond was fragile, and it could easily be shattered by the casual cruelty that some soldiers exhibited towards their black comrades. The young man's letter was not just a record of the physical pain he endured but a reflection of the emotional and psychological toll the war took on him. Each word of his letter seemed to drip with the exhaustion he felt, not just from the constant violence, but from the soul-crushing awareness that his country, the very nation he was fighting for, did not fully acknowledge his sacrifice. He had witnessed firsthand the ways in which black soldiers were treated as less than their white counterparts, not only in terms of recognition but also in the distribution of resources, medical care, and even basic human respect. He wrote to his mother about the desperate conditions, the way they were often given the most dangerous assignments, sent to fight in the most perilous places, while others were kept safely behind the lines. He spoke of the indignities of being placed in segregated units, forced to train in subpar conditions, and constantly reminded of their lesser status in the eyes of the military establishment. But the most heart-wrenching part of his letter was the way he described his feelings of betrayal. He had been led to believe that by serving his country, by risking his life on the front lines, he would be recognized as an equal. But instead, he felt as though he had been cast aside, left to die for a country that had never truly accepted him. As he wrote, he also reflected on the other soldiers around him, black soldiers from all walks of life, united by the same desire to prove themselves. There was a quiet solidarity among them, a shared understanding that they were fighting not just for their country, but for a place in it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the grim reality they faced. For many, their service was not about patriotism, it was about survival. They had to endure hatred and the prejudice because there was no other choice. The military had promised them the chance to fight for freedom. But that promise was never fully realized. But there was something else in the letter, something that made the young man's message even more poignant. He didn't just write about the injustices he faced on the battlefield, he also wrote about the impact this experience had on him personally. His sense of identity, his place in the world, was shaken to its core. The young soldier had always believed in the ideals of freedom and equality, but with each passing day in the war, those ideals seemed more like hollow words. He began to question what he was truly fighting for. Was it for a better future, or was it for a country that refused to change? Was it worth the cost? His letter was full of love and longing for his mother, the woman who had raised him with such strength and pride. He spoke of the memories of home, the way her voice soothed him, the warmth of her embrace, and the way she always told him he was destined for greatness. He wanted her to know that he had tried, that he had done his best. But as he wrote, it became clear that he wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to himself, trying to make sense of the chaos around him. His words were a form of catharsis, a desperate attempt to understand his place in a world that seemed to have no place for him. As the letter continued, the young man's tone shifted. He became more reflective, his words more measured. He spoke about the uncertainty of the future, the knowledge that the end of the war was nowhere in sight. The days seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one filled with a new challenge, a new tragedy. He knew that the likelihood of returning home was slim, and with each battle, that possibility seemed to fade further and further into the distance. His body was battered and bruised, but it was his spirit that had been broken the most. Despite the pain and fear he faced, the young soldier remained determined to carry on. But his letter revealed something deeper, something that he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for recognition, for a sense of dignity, for the hope that someday, someone would see him not as a black man fighting for a white man's war, but as a human being who had given everything in the name of something greater than himself. The more he wrote, the clearer it became. The letter wasn't just about his final goodbye. It was his plea for understanding, for recognition of the sacrifice that black soldiers like him had made. It was a testament to their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering belief that, despite everything, they could change the world. But as he signed his name and folded the letter, a sense of finality settled over him. He knew it was likely the last time he would be able to put his thoughts into words. But what happened next was even more astonishing. The letter didn't end with his death, as one might expect. No, it had a strange afterlife of its own, one that would reveal secrets and truths that no one could have anticipated. As the letter made its way back to the United States, it carried with it more than just the voice of one soldier, it carried the voices of countless others who had been silenced for far too long. The words of the letter would go on to ignite a firestorm of controversy, questioning the very nature of wartime heroism and the sacrifices made by those who had been marginalized and forgotten. And as we continue to uncover the deeper layers of this story, one question remains: how much longer will the truth stay hidden? What will it take for the world to finally hear the voices of those who fought and died in silence? The answers lie within the pages of the letter, and as we move forward, the truth will continue to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. As the young soldier's letter began its journey back home, its contents carried an undeniable weight, one that would ripple through the lives of those who came across it. At first, it seemed like just another piece of correspondence from the front lines, another letter full of sorrow and longing. But there was something different about this one. It spoke not only to his mother but to the very core of a society that had ignored the pain of black soldiers for far too long. The letter began to change the way people saw the war, the soldiers who fought it, and the racial divide that had plagued the military for decades. Back in the soldier's hometown, his mother received the letter with mixed emotions. She had always known that her son's chances of returning home were slim, but reading the final words he had written filled her with a deep sense of loss and anger. She could hear his voice in every line, the familiar cadence of his words that had once comforted her. But now, those words felt like a cruel reminder of all that had been stolen from him. She knew her son had enlisted with the hope of gaining respect, of proving his worth, not just as a soldier but as a man. But the reality of what he faced, the weight of his disillusionment, was too much for her to bear. She had spent her life fighting for the rights of black people, fighting against the injustices that had plagued her community, but nothing could prepare her for the devastation that came with reading her son's final plea. Her grief was not just for her son but for the countless others who had faced similar struggles and had never had a voice. She knew that if this letter were to be shared, it could bring attention to the larger, systemic issues that black soldiers had endured. But would the world listen? Would anyone care about the pain of a black soldier whose life had been cut short in a war that never fully embraced him? Her heart ached as she realized that her son had been fighting not just for freedom, but for recognition that had always been out of reach. Across the country, the letter sparked a quiet revolution of sorts, as other families of black soldiers began to speak out, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and sacrifice. In military circles, the letter was read with a mix of skepticism and discomfort. Some saw it as a reflection of a soldier's emotional state, a temporary lapse in judgment, while others were horrified by its truth. Officers and politicians who had long been content to ignore the racial divides within the military were suddenly forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of the system they had upheld. But the question remained, would this letter be the spark that would ignite meaningful change, or would it be buried, just like so many others before it? Meanwhile, in the trenches, the young man's comrades continued to fight, unaware of the firestorm that was unfolding back home. For them, the war had become a daily struggle to survive, a series of battles that seemed to stretch on without end. They had heard rumors of the letter, but most of them were too caught up in the horrors around them to pay much attention. To them, survival was all that mattered. The young man's letter, filled with raw emotion and disillusionment, had not been seen by everyone in the unit. But the impact of his words lingered in the air like a shadow, casting a dark pall over the group. Many of them had lost brothers, comrades they had fought beside, and the pain of those losses was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But even in their shared grief, there was a growing sense that something was wrong, something bigger than just the war itself. The soldiers began to talk amongst themselves, their conversations filled with quiet murmurs of frustration and anger. They had all felt the sting of discrimination, but now, in the wake of the letter, it seemed as if that pain had been given a name, a voice. The soldiers began to realize that the war was not just a physical battle, it was a psychological one. The divisions they had been forced to endure, the constant reminders that they were not seen as equal, had taken a toll on their spirits. They had been sent to fight for freedom, but their own personal freedom was never truly acknowledged. There was a quiet rebellion growing in the ranks, an undercurrent of dissatisfaction that was threatening to boil over. Some soldiers spoke of mutiny, of taking a stand against the system that had mistreated them for so long. But the reality of that was daunting. They were soldiers, trained to follow orders, to obey the commands of their superiors. A mutiny, though enticing, was a dangerous proposition, one that could lead to unimaginable consequences. And yet, the idea lingered in the minds of those who had suffered long enough. As the letter continued to circulate, its impact spread beyond the military. Civil rights groups took notice, seeing it as a powerful tool in their fight for equality. Activists, leaders, and families of black soldiers began to rally around the letter, using it as a symbol of the larger struggle for justice. But even within these movements, there was division. Some believed that the letter should be used to expose the injustice of the military system, to call for immediate change and accountability. Others, more cautious, feared that pushing too hard would result in backlash, and even greater suffering for those on the front lines. The tension between these two factions grew, each group eager to take action but unsure of how best to proceed. The young man's mother found herself torn between these differing viewpoints. She wanted the world to know the truth, to understand the cost of her son's sacrifice. But she also knew that the political climate was volatile, that any misstep could result in more pain and suffering for her community. She had seen the power of activism, but she had also seen the power of retaliation. The road ahead was unclear, and every decision carried weight. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, a burden she hadn't expected to bear. Yet she knew that her son's letter could be the catalyst for something greater. But at what cost? As time passed, the letter continued to haunt the soldier's comrades. Those who had fought beside him began to speak out, sharing their own experiences, their own versions of the pain and injustice that had been inflicted upon them. The young man's words had given them the courage to finally confront the truth. The weight of their silence had been too much to bear, and now they were beginning to find their voice. Some spoke in whispers, others more boldly, but all of them were driven by the same desire, to be seen, to be heard, and to ensure that the sacrifices they had made would not be forgotten. But in the shadows, there were forces working to keep the story buried. Powerful individuals who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, who feared the truth that this letter exposed, began to work behind the scenes to discredit it. They launched a campaign to smear the soldier's reputation, to paint him as nothing more than an angry, disillusioned man who had let his emotions cloud his judgment. They hoped that by discrediting him, they could erase the power of his words, bury the truth he had uncovered. But the more they tried to suppress the letter, the more it seemed to gain momentum. As the tension mounted, both in the military and in the streets, the young soldier's letter became a symbol of something much larger. It became a call to action, a plea for justice that could no longer be ignored. And yet, despite all the noise, the pain, and the anger, the fundamental question remained: would anything change? Would the world finally recognize the sacrifices of those who had fought and died for a country that had never truly accepted them? The answer to that question was still unknown, but the story of this soldier, his final letter, his life, and the legacy he left behind was far from over. The pressure was mounting on all sides. As the young soldier's letter continued to ripple through the country, the world began to take notice. The quiet whispers of discontent grew louder, until they could no longer be ignored. In the cities, in the small towns, and even in the halls of power, there was a growing sense of unease. The questions that had been buried for so long, the questions about equality, justice, and the treatment of black soldiers, were finally being asked aloud. And the answers were not easy. Back home, the soldier's mother could feel the weight of the moment. She had always been a strong woman, a pillar of her community, but now she found herself standing at the center of a storm. The letter had sparked a fire that was burning out of control, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the truth was impossible to ignore. She knew that if the letter was allowed to fade into the background, if the world didn't fully hear its message, it would be a grave injustice not just to her son, but to the countless others who had suffered in silence. But as the pressure built, so did the fear. There were powerful forces working behind the scenes, doing everything in their power to suppress the letter's message. Those who had long profited from the inequality and racial injustice in the military were now scrambling to protect their interests. They began to circulate rumors, discrediting the soldier's final words, accusing him of being unstable, of allowing his emotions to cloud his judgment. The media, once so eager to sensationalize every aspect of the war, now found itself torn. Some outlets pushed to amplify the story, recognizing its importance as a turning point in the fight for civil rights, while others, fearing the consequences of challenging the status quo, chose to remain silent or even spin the narrative in a way that undermined the soldier's message. On the front lines, the young soldier's comrades were growing restless. The letter had planted a seed in their minds, one that could not be easily shaken. They began to question everything about the war, about their role in it, and about the people who had sent them into the conflict. The tension in their unit was palpable. There were no longer just conversations about survival. Now, there were talks of revolt, of standing up for what was right, of refusing to continue fighting for a system that had never shown them any respect. But those conversations were risky, and as much as they wanted to act on their anger, they knew the consequences could be devastating. The military was watching closely, and any hint of insubordination could result in brutal punishment. The young soldier's letter had made them realize that they were not just pawns in a distant war, they were part of a larger struggle, a fight that went beyond the battlefield. They were fighting for their dignity, their humanity, and for the recognition they had been denied for far too long. And yet, as the soldiers grew more emboldened, they also became more divided. Some pushed for action, wanting to bring the fight directly to the leadership, while others were cautious, fearful of what could happen if they crossed a line that they could never come back from. At home, the soldier's mother was doing everything in her power to keep the momentum going. She met with activists, politicians, and community leaders, pushing for the story to remain in the public eye. She knew that the longer the story lingered, the more likely it was that change could come. But there were days when the weight of the struggle felt too much to bear. She knew that if the country truly acknowledged the horrors her son had faced, it would mean confronting a painful truth about itself. The question of how far she was willing to go to keep that truth alive hung heavy in the air. The soldiers who had fought alongside her son were also beginning to feel the pressure of the world watching them. Some had already returned home, having survived the brutal war, and now found themselves in an unfamiliar position, suddenly seen as heroes, though they felt far from it. The memories of what they had endured were fresh, raw, and painful. Some tried to find solace in their return to civilian life, while others struggled to reconcile their experiences with the way society viewed them. For many, the war had left deep scars that went beyond the physical. They had been changed forever, and no amount of recognition could ever fully heal those wounds. But as the story continued to unfold, it became clear that something was coming to a head. The pressure on both sides, the forces fighting to suppress the truth and the voices pushing for change, was reaching its breaking point. In Washington, there were behind-the-scenes negotiations, political maneuvering, and calculated moves designed to keep the status quo intact. But those who had seen the letter and understood its power were not backing down. They knew that the only way to create real change was to expose the ugly truths that had been hidden for so long. The soldier's mother, along with other families who had lost their sons to this war, began to organize. They demanded that their voices be heard, that the stories of their children, their husbands, and their brothers be recognized. They were no longer willing to stay silent, no longer willing to let the narrative be shaped by those who had never truly understood the cost of their sacrifices. The battle for justice was now being fought on two fronts, one in the streets, where people were marching and protesting for the truth, and the other in the halls of power, where the decision-makers were trying desperately to hold on to their control. And then came the day when the breaking point finally arrived. The young soldier's letter, now a symbol of a much larger movement, was being read aloud in front of a congressional committee. This was at the moment that could change everything. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, from the military brass to civilian activists, from politicians to journalists. The tension in the air was suffocating. This was not just a hearing, it was a battle for the truth. As the letter was read aloud, the words took on a life of their own. Every sentence, every phrase seemed to pulse with the energy of those who had been silenced for so long. The weight of the soldier's words hung in the air like a cloud, one that threatened to burst open and reveal everything that had been hidden. Outside the building, the protests grew louder. People were gathering, holding signs that read, "We demand justice, and remember the fallen." The cries for equality, for recognition, for change were deafening. The world was watching, and the moment of reckoning was at hand. But just as the hearing reached its peak, when it seemed like the truth would finally be acknowledged, something unexpected happened. The doors to the hearing room opened, and a high-ranking officer, one of the very men who had long been a symbol of the military's refusal to change, stepped forward. His face was cold, unreadable, but his presence was enough to make everyone in the room pause. The tension in the room was unbearable. The officer's eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. The words he was about to speak could tip the balance one way or another. Would he defend the system, or would he acknowledge the truth of the soldier's letter? Would this be the moment everything changed, or would it be the moment the struggle was pushed back into the shadows once again? And as the officer opened his mouth, the room held its collective breath, unsure of what would come next. The fate of the soldier's letter and the larger battle for justice hung in the balance. The officer stood at the front of the room, the weight of his position pressing down on him. For a moment, the room was filled with a deafening silence, the anticipation thick enough to cut through the air. The eyes of everyone in the room were fixed on him, waiting for him to speak, to either confirm or deny the truths that had been so boldly exposed in the soldier's final letter. He cleared his throat, a subtle gesture, yet it seemed to reverberate through the tense atmosphere. But instead of launching into a defense of the military or offering some carefully crafted response, the officer did something that no one expected. He paused, his gaze shifting over the crowd, and then, in a move that stunned everyone, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. His hands were steady, but his face betrayed the slightest flicker of uncertainty. The room held its breath. What was he doing? Was this a distraction, an attempt to take control of the moment? Or was there something else at play? The officer's fingers trembled ever so slightly as he unfolded the letter, and when he began to speak, his voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but there was a tension underneath it. This letter, he began, looking directly at the audience, was never meant to see the light of day. A murmur swept through the room. What did he mean by that? Was he about to claim that the soldier had never written the letter? That it was a forgery? The soldiers who had fought beside the young man, and the families who had rallied behind him, felt a rush of panic. Could it all be unraveling? But then, the officer dropped the bombshell. This letter is part of a much larger set of documents, he continued. Documents that have been hidden away for years. They contain the truth about the military's treatment of black soldiers much more than what has been shared so far. Gasps filled the room. The soldier's eyes widened, the weight of what the officer was revealing sinking in. For a moment, there was confusion. How could he be saying this? Was he admitting to the atrocities, or was this another attempt to control the narrative? As the officer's words sank in, he went on. These documents were meant to stay buried, as were the stories of those who have been silenced. But it is clear now that the truth cannot be ignored any longer. The time has come for everything to be laid bare. For the first time, the officer's voice wavered, betraying a hint of emotion that had been carefully concealed. The room grew even quieter, the audience straining to absorb what was being said. Was he trying to atone for something, or was this an elaborate setup? Was the officer truly prepared to expose the full extent of the military's racism, or was he merely pushing a narrative to protect himself and his comrades? Before anyone could react, the officer gestured to his aide, who brought forward a stack of documents. These weren't just any papers, they were meticulously categorized, labeled, and bound together. The room could sense the weight of history in those papers. The aide placed the documents on the table in front of the officer, and as he did so, the truth began to unfurl in a way no one had expected. These weren't just records of one soldier's pain, one letter from the battlefield, they were records of hundreds of soldiers, their experiences and struggles documented, their lives reduced to files. The officer continued, his voice low but compelling. What you are about to see changes everything. This is not just the story of one soldier. It is the story of an entire generation of black soldiers who fought in wars for a country that refused to see them as equals. These documents were suppressed for a reason, and now, It's time to understand why. A sense of disbelief rippled through the room. What was the officer trying to say? Was this some kind of revelation, or was it a trap? The crowd had been expecting the military to deny the truth, to spin the narrative to discredit the soldier and protect the status quo. But now, it seemed as if something far more complex and sinister was unfolding. If these documents were real, if they truly contained a history of black soldiers and their struggles, then the story was far from over. This wasn't just a fight over one letter, it was a fight for the very soul of the military, for the recognition of soldiers who had long been ignored. But before anyone could react, the officer dropped another bombshell. I have been part of this system. I have seen what these men and women endured. And I've done nothing about it. He looked down, as if weighed down by guilt, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might finally break, reveal his own role in the cover-up. I've been silent, just like so many others. But that ends now. The truth must come to light, no matter the cost. The room was in chaos now. The families, the activists, the soldiers, they didn't know whether to trust this officer or see him as yet another figure in a long line of people who had failed them. Could they believe him? Was he truly trying to make amends, or was this another part of the system working to protect itself? And then, just as the crowd was reeling from this new revelation, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "We knew it," a soldier shouted, standing up from his seat. "We knew there were more of us. We knew the stories were bigger than what you wanted to tell us." Others joined in, their voices rising in agreement. The truth, it seemed, was coming faster than anyone had anticipated. The momentum was shifting. The soldiers who had remained silent for so long were beginning to speak, their own stories flooding to the surface, ready to be told. But even as the room erupted in a frenzy of emotions, the officer held up his hand, silencing the crowd. "This is just the beginning," he said. "What I am about to show you will change everything. But be prepared, some of what you see will be difficult to bear. The cost of this truth is greater than any of you may realize." The audience leaned in, their hearts pounding. What was in those documents? What was the officer about to reveal? And who would be left standing when the truth finally came to light? The air was thick with anticipation, the tension unbearable. There were no answers yet, only more questions, more revelations hanging in the balance. The stakes had never been higher. Would the officer's admission lead to change? Or was this just the latest move in a dangerous game, a twist in a story that was far from over? As the officer began to flip through the pages of the documents, the room went silent once again. The world was waiting for the next chapter of this story. And with each turn of the page, the stakes grew higher. The officer flipped through the documents slowly, methodically. Each page seemed to carry a weight heavier than the last, and as the room held its breath, the words he read aloud began to reveal truths that no one was prepared for. It was like watching the pieces of a puzzle finally come together, but the image that emerged was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The first documents described the conditions soldiers had endured, black soldiers sent to the front lines with insufficient equipment, treated as expendable, their suffering dismissed by those in power. The next pages were filled with testimonies, not from the battlefield, but from the barracks, from the places where men were supposed to rest and recover. The letters spoke of harsh punishment for minor infractions, of brutal training exercises designed to break them, and of racist officers who made sure the black soldiers knew their place. The letters grew more personal, more desperate, revealing the emotional toll the soldiers had taken in silence for so long. The officer's voice trembled as he read the final page. It was a letter from a man who had fought alongside the soldier whose letter had sparked this entire movement. The man's words were sharp with anger, but laced with a deep sadness. "We were not heroes," he wrote. "We were pawns in a game we were never meant to win. But our sacrifice will not be forgotten. We may not have seen the truth then, but the world will see it now." As the officer read those final words aloud, the room was silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The documents were undeniable. The military had known about the abuse, had allowed it to continue, and had actively tried to suppress any record of the soldiers' suffering. These men, who had fought bravely for a country that did not treat them as equals, had been forgotten. But now, their stories were being heard. For a moment, it seemed like the battle was over. The truth had come to light, the documents were out in the open, and the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But just as the officer finished reading the last line, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the building, followed by shouting from outside. The doors burst open, and a group of military personnel stormed in, their faces grim. They moved quickly, positioning themselves around the officer, their eyes scanning the room with cold precision. The audience gasped, unsure of what was happening. Had the officer's confession been part of a larger plan all along? Was this another move to regain control? One of the men at the front, a high-ranking general, stepped forward and raised his hand. "This is not the end," he declared, his voice commanding attention. "This is where it ends." The room fell into chaos once more. The soldiers who had hoped for justice, the families who had stood by them, all now realized that their victory might be slipping through their fingers. The general's words echoed in their minds, "This is where it ends." But what did that mean? As the general began to speak again, he revealed something that no one had seen coming. "We've known about these documents for a long time," he said, his voice calm but filled with an unsettling certainty. "They were never meant to come out. They were a part of a plan. A plan that, until now, has kept everything in balance." The audience was stunned. How could this be? The general was admitting to knowing about the very things they had just uncovered. But it wasn't just a simple confession. He wasn't denying the atrocities. Instead, he was suggesting that everything, every single action taken by the military, had been part of a larger strategy to maintain control. The soldiers, the letters, the suffering, it had all been orchestrated for a reason. This was never about justice, the general continued, his eyes narrowing. This was always about power. And now, you've unleashed something that can't be stopped. The crowd stood frozen, unable to comprehend what the general was saying. Was he suggesting that the military had been using these soldiers as pawns in a much larger game? Was the system so deeply corrupt that it was not just about protecting itself, it was about manipulating the very narrative that was being spun around them? Before anyone could react, the general reached into his coat and pulled out a small, hidden device, a trigger. With a steady hand, he pressed it, and suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light. The walls seemed to vibrate, the air thick with tension. The officer, who had been reading the documents, staggered back, eyes wide with shock. What was happening? Had the general activated something that would silence them all? For a split second, everything seemed to stop, time itself holding its breath. Then, the building erupted into chaos. Alarms blared, and the sound of footsteps pounding down the hall echoed as security personnel flooded the room. But it wasn't just a security breach. It was something far worse. The documents, the truth they had fought so hard to expose, were suddenly no longer in their hands. In the chaos, the officer who had first revealed the truth was rushed away, his fate uncertain. The documents, those pages that had held the hopes of so many, were now locked away, and the room was left in turmoil. The general's last words echoed in their ears, "You've unleashed something that can't be stopped." But what did that mean? What was happening now? And who would stand up to the system that had just revealed itself to be even more powerful and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined? The room, now emptied of all but a few, stood still. The soldiers, their families, the activists, they had all come so close to seeing the truth, to finally bringing justice to light. But now, it seemed, that hope was slipping further and further out of reach. The battle was far from over. And as the dust settled, one final question loomed over them all. Was this truly the end of the struggle, or was this just the beginning of something far more dangerous? The truth was still out there, but now it was buried deeper than ever. And the world would never be the same again. The room was eerily quiet now. The chaos that had erupted moments earlier had settled into a tense stillness. The alarms had faded into the distance, and the security personnel who had stormed in seemed to have vanished as quickly as they appeared. Only a few people remained in the room, staring at the remnants of what could have been a victory, but now felt like a loss. The officer who had once boldly read from the documents was gone. The documents themselves, the very key to their cause, were now sealed away, hidden from sight, locked in a vault that no one had access to. For a long time, no one spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung over them like a thick fog. The words of the general, "You've unleashed something that can't be stopped," echoed in the minds of those who had been fighting for justice. It was as though the world had shifted beneath their feet, and they weren't sure where to stand anymore. But then, one voice broke through the silence. A young soldier, who had stood at the back of the room during the entire ordeal, stepped forward. His eyes were wide, filled with a mix of disbelief and determination. "We can't just give up," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We've come this far. We have to keep fighting." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Others began to nod, the resolve in their faces hardening. Yes, they had been dealt a blow. Yes, the documents were now out of reach. But that didn't mean the fight was over. They had come this far because of the bravery of those who had stood up and spoken out, and they weren't about to let that bravery go to waste. The realization began to spread among them. The battle had never been just about those specific documents, or even about the officer's confession. It was about the larger story, the truth that had been buried for so long, and the voices of those who had been silenced. The struggle was bigger than any one letter, bigger than any single revelation. It was about standing up to a system that had built its power on the oppression of others. And that system, they realized, wasn't just going to fall because a few truths were exposed. It had been built to last. But it was also fragile, because as long as people were willing to speak out, it could never be truly secure. As the days passed, the momentum didn't slow. It was quiet at first, whispers, online movements, anonymous leaks, but soon, the truth began to spread like wildfire. More soldiers came forward, each one sharing their own stories of injustice, of sacrifice, and of the cruelty they had endured. Their voices were heard in places they had never been before, in courtrooms, in newsrooms, on social media, and in the hearts of the public. People who had long been blind to the struggles of black soldiers began to see the full scope of the injustice they had suffered. It wasn't just about racism in the military, it was about a history of systemic oppression that had been ignored for far too long. The families who had been torn apart by war, who had lost loved ones in battles that seemed endless, began to unite. They weren't fighting alone anymore. They were part of a larger movement, a fight for recognition, for respect, and for justice. And slowly, the tide began to turn. The public outcry grew louder, and the government couldn't ignore it any longer. But even as these victories started to pile up, the mystery of the documents and the officer's confession lingered. People wanted to know more. They wanted to understand why the general had made his chilling statement about unleashing something that couldn't be stopped. What did he mean by that? Was there something even darker lurking beneath the surface? And then, just as the story seemed to be winding down, a new revelation came to light, one that would change everything. It was a simple phone call, an anonymous tip. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, almost too quiet to hear, but the message was clear: the documents aren't gone. They'd been moved. And I know where they are. The tip led to a series of secret meetings, hushed conversations, and hidden locations. As the puzzle pieces started to fit together, it became clear that the documents hadn't been destroyed or erased. They had been taken to a private facility, one that had been set up years ago, just in case something like this ever happened. It was a place where the government could store the most dangerous secrets, away from prying eyes. But now, someone had found a way to reach it. In the dead of night, a small group of trusted individuals, led by the same soldiers who had been fighting for justice, made their way to the facility. They knew the risks, they knew the dangers of uncovering such explosive information. But the desire for truth outweighed their fear. They couldn't let this chance slip away. When they finally reached the facility and broke through the security, they found the documents, all of them, stored in a room that looked like a vault. The walls were lined with rows upon rows of boxes, filled with files that had been kept hidden for decades. It was a treasure trove of history, pain, sacrifice, and resistance documented in ways the public had never seen. And within those files was the final piece of the puzzle, the missing letter. It was the letter of a soldier who had been considered a hero in the eyes of the military, but who had suffered in silence, knowing the system would never recognize him. His letter had been buried for years, not just because of its content, but because it had the potential to bring the entire military system down. The soldiers, along with the families and activists who had joined them in their fight, knew what they had to do. This was the moment. This was their chance to expose everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It wasn't just about revenge or anger anymore. It was about rewriting the history that had been distorted for so long. As the documents were released to the public, the backlash was immediate. The military tried to suppress the information, but it was too late. The floodgates had been opened. The country was forced to confront its past, its treatment of black soldiers, its systemic racism, its failures. The truth, raw and unflinching, was out in the open. But in the end, the most surprising twist came not from the documents themselves, but from the people who had fought to bring them to light. The soldier who had sparked the movement was finally recognized not as a hero of war, but as a hero of truth. The families who had been denied closure found some peace, knowing that their loved ones' sacrifices were no longer in vain. But for now, the world had been changed. The fight for justice hadn't been won overnight, but it had been won in the end. And as the dust settled, one thing was clear: the truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. The final words of the soldier's letter, the one that had started it all, remained etched in the hearts of all who had fought alongside him. We may not have seen the truth then, but the world will see it now. And they did.